Verse 53. When the mind, released from conditions and unsupported by thought of self, abides no longer in the body, to me there is no objective world. So when the mind, released from conditions. Verse 50 told us that the causes of mind are ignorance, desire, and karma. This is the mind. The mind constantly looking outwards for fulfillment, devoid of any spiritual insight. So when there's spiritual insight and we're no longer dominated by desire, in the sense that our actions are determined by it, then there is no mind. When, as it says here, it's unsupported by thought of self. In other words, we are no longer dominated by the notion of being an individual self, experiencing an external world. Being dominated by desire is based on the assumption that there's an individual self here and an external world, and that this individual self can somehow find deep fulfillment by obtaining things from this external world. This is spiritual ignorance, and this is what, as enlightenment practitioners, we're giving up. We're moving towards what I call a sense of being, taking that as our anchor rather than our desire. So this is what the Buddha is saying. Give up thought of self, give up thought of an individual, and giving up any idea that there's an objective world out there. This is a world of objects. It's not objective in the sense of rational thinking, it's objective in the sense of objectified, an objectified world. So what else is there in this verse? It says, abides no longer in the body. When the mind, released from conditions and unsupported by thought of self, abides no longer in the body. Now we must be careful here. The Buddha is not talking about some ethereal, astral, out-of-body state. He's talking about that whole way of thinking, that whole way of imagining that we are individual entities in a separate body. Now how does this work? Well, the whole thrust of all my videos is fueled by what Douglas Harding calls headlessness. This is the perspective of his book called On Having No Head, which is subtitled Zen and the Rediscovery of the Obvious. And what he's saying is, we actually have no head. From a conventional perspective, of course we've got a head, of course we've got a body, but there is no direct experience of having a head. It's an inference. We infer that we have a head. There's experience, resistance. All I've got here is a sort of spongy resistance here, spongy and bony resistance here. From that I infer I have a head, but there's only that sensation that I mentioned. If you ask me what I have here, if I was being perfectly honest, if I was saying what is obvious, rediscovery of the obvious, what I have here, what I'm experiencing here, is the whole world. I'm not experiencing a head. I'm experiencing the whole world, at least in its visual aspect. That's what's happening on these shoulders. On these shoulders is the whole world. Is that not obvious to you? Is that not your experience? But we don't say that. We say I have a head, which is quite a different thing, quite a limited thing. So this is what it's about. It's about getting in touch with the obvious once again, not with what we think is happening, not with what conventional reality says is happening, but with what is obviously happening. The whole world, the whole visual panorama is on these shoulders. So in the same way, if we can acknowledge that there's no head, then it's quite simple to take the next step and say, well, there's no body either. All there are sensations. I'm the center of certain experiences right now, certain sensations, which in conventional terms I can ascribe to a body. But that's a step removed, at least one step removed from the obvious. And the obvious is whatever sensations are happening right now. So you can see how the whole notion of having a head and having a body is dismantled, deconstructed. There's only experiencing going on. There's only the field of experiencing, which for conventional purposes we talk about. We break down into a self and an objectified world. And you might think, well, that's very clever, although it's not really. It's just being very unclever, being very simple. It's the conventional aspect which is clever. But anyway, you might think, well, okay, that's very clever. You might not go along with this. What's the point, you might say? Well, the point is, it dismantles the support of the mind. It dismantles the conditions that give rise to the egoistic mind. If there's no sense of being a body in an objectified world, then there's no point to desire. There's no point to grasping. There's no point to hatred and aversion. There's no point to fear and anxiety. There's a dropping of all tension, a dropping of all insecurities. There's an opening up to wonder. And an unalloyed bliss. Now we're practicing enlightenment.